The eviction notice fluttered in the mountain wind as three officials climbed the dirt path to the remote cabin. Just paperwork to them. Another stubborn old man refusing to leave property that belonged to the state now. They'd done this before. But when Sheriff Rodriguez stepped inside that one-room cabin, something in the corner caught his eye. A dusty wooden box, cracked open just enough to reveal what lay inside. Medals, ribbons, unit patches from wars most people only read about in history books. One medal in particular stopped him cold. Purple with gold edges, a profile of Washington in the center. His hands trembled as he picked up the accompanying citation. What he read next changed everything. Because this wasn't just some hermit hiding from the world. This was a man who'd taken a bullet meant for his entire unit. And now the country he'd bled for was trying to throw him out of the only home he had left. Welcome to Silent Salute, where we uncover the heroes hiding in plain sight. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe our veterans deserve better than this, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Your support helps us share these important stories. The cabin had stood in those Colorado mountains for 43 years. Built by hand from timber cut on the property, weathered by decades of harsh winters and blazing summers. To most people driving the winding mountain road below, it was barely visible through the pine trees. Just another dot of human habitation in the vast wilderness of the Rocky Mountains. But to Thomas Bear Mitchell, it was everything. Home, sanctuary, and the only place on earth where the nightmares sometimes stayed quiet long enough for him to sleep. Bear had bought the 20-acre plot in 1981 with his discharge pay and a small inheritance from his father. Back then, the land was worthless to developers. Too remote, too steep, too difficult to access for anyone wanting to build something profitable. Perfect for a man who wanted nothing more than to disappear into the mountains and forget the things he'd seen in the jungles of Vietnam. He'd built the cabin himself over 2 summers, learning carpentry from library books and trial and error. One room, efficient and simple. A wood stove for heat, a small generator for electricity when he needed it, a well he'd dug by hand. No phone, no internet, no connection to a world that had moved on without him while he'd been fighting a war half the country wanted to forget. For 4 decades, Bear had lived quietly in his mountain refuge. He kept to himself, troubled no one, asked nothing from anyone. Twice a month, he'd drive his battered pickup truck down to the small town of Cedar Ridge for supplies. The locals knew him as a polite but distant figure who paid his bills in cash and never caused trouble. What they didn't know was that Bear was haunted by memories that wouldn't fade. Images of friends who'd died in his arms. The weight of decisions made in split seconds that saved some lives and couldn't save others. The kind of experiences that marked a man's soul permanently and made peaceful sleep a rare luxury. The cabin was his refuge from all of that. In the silence of the mountains, surrounded by trees that had been growing since before he was born, Bear could sometimes find moments of peace. He'd sit on his small porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the peaks, and remember what it felt like to be just Thomas Mitchell instead of a collection of memories and scars. But times had changed in Colorado. What had once been worthless mountain land was now valuable. Ski resorts were expanding. Wealthy individuals were buying remote properties for vacation homes. The state government, always looking for ways to increase revenue, had begun reassessing land ownership and tax obligations throughout the mountain counties. That's how Bear's quiet existence had come to the attention of bureaucrats in Denver. His property taxes had been miscalculated for years, they claimed. He owed back taxes, penalties, and interest that totaled more than the cabin was worth. Pay up or face eviction proceedings. Bear had tried to explain that he'd been paying what the county assessor had told him to pay for 40 years. But paperwork had been lost, computer systems had been updated, and records from the 1980s weren't as clear as they should have been. The state's position was simple: pay the full amount or lose the property. For a man living on a small disability pension and no other income, the demanded sum might as well have been $1 million. Bear had offered to pay what he could, had asked for a payment plan, had even suggested donating the land to the state park system rather than see it developed. But bureaucracy doesn't bend easily, and the eviction process had moved forward with the inexorable grinding of government machinery. Sheriff Maria Rodriguez had received the eviction order on a gray October morning when the first snow of the season was already dusting the high peaks. She'd been putting off serving it for 2 weeks, hoping some last-minute solution might present itself. She knew Bear by reputation if not personally, and the idea of throwing an elderly veteran out of his home didn't sit well with her. But duty was duty, and the law was the law. She'd assembled a small team for the eviction. Herself, a county social worker named David Chun who specialized in cases involving vulnerable individuals, and Jake Peterson from the county assessor's office who'd driven up from Denver specifically for this case. The drive up the mountain road to Bear's cabin was beautiful in the way that only Colorado autumn could be. Golden aspens mixed with dark green pine, the air crisp and clean, snow-capped peaks visible in every direction. It was the kind of scenery that reminded people why they loved living in Colorado, why they were willing to deal with harsh winters and high altitude and the challenges of mountain life. It was also the kind of place that made Rodriguez wonder why anyone would want to force a man to leave. There was something almost sacred about the isolation, the connection to nature, the simplicity of a life lived away from the complications of modern society. Bear's cabin came into view as they rounded the final bend. It was smaller than Rodriguez had expected, but surprisingly well-maintained. The roof looked solid, the walls were straight, and the small porch was swept clean. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating Bear was home and probably watching their approach. Rodriguez parked her patrol car next to Bear's old pickup truck and took a deep breath. This was the part of her job she hated most. Not the dangerous calls or the domestic disputes or even the occasional violence. It was moments like this, when she had to enforce laws that felt fundamentally wrong, that made her question why she'd become a police officer in the first place. The three officials climbed the wooden steps to the cabin's porch. Rodriguez knocked firmly but not aggressively on the door. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Sheriff Rodriguez. I need to speak with you." The door opened slowly, revealing a man in his 70s with a gray beard and eyes that held the particular kind of wariness that came from seeing too much of the world's cruelty. Thomas Bear, Mitchell stood in his doorway like a man preparing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. "I suppose you're here about the eviction," Bear said quietly. "I'm afraid so, sir," Rodriguez replied. "I have papers I need to serve, and Mr. Chun here is from Social Services. He's here to help you with relocation options." Bear stepped aside to let them enter, but his movements were those of a man under siege. Rodriguez could see the weight of defeat in his shoulders, the exhaustion of someone who'd fought too many battles and was finally running out of strength for one more. The interior of the cabin was spare but clean. One room serving as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. A small wood stove provided heat, and the only furniture was a simple bed, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding books and supplies. Everything a man needed to live, nothing he didn't. But Rodriguez was struck by how orderly everything was. Military precision in the way items were arranged, the way the bed was made, the way even the firewood was stacked with geometric perfection. This wasn't the home of someone who'd given up on life. This was the refuge of someone who'd found a way to survive on his own terms. Jake Peterson from the assessor's office was already pulling out paperwork, clearly eager to get this unpleasant task finished quickly. "Mr. Mitchell, I have the final eviction notice here. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Any personal property left behind will be disposed of by the county." Bear nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. "I understand. I'll be gone by tomorrow morning." Rodriguez felt something twist in her stomach. She'd expected anger, pleading, maybe even resistance. Instead, Bear was accepting his fate with the resigned dignity of someone who'd learned that fighting the system was often futile. David Chun, the social worker, stepped forward with a gentler approach. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm here to help you find alternative housing. There are assisted living facilities in Grand Junction that have openings, and the VA has programs for veterans in transitional situations." "I appreciate that," Bear replied, "but I won't be needing assistance. I'll figure something out." The conversation felt surreal to Rodriguez. Here was a man being forced from his home of 4 decades, and he was responding with the same calm politeness he might show to guests. There was something both admirable and heartbreaking about his composure. Peterson was growing impatient. "Sir, I need to document the condition of the property for the state. Do you mind if I look around?" Bear gestured toward the cabin's interior. "Help yourself. Everything's pretty much what you see. As Peterson began taking photos and making notes on his clipboard, Rodriguez found herself studying Bear more carefully. There was something about his bearing, his posture, the way he held himself that reminded her of her father, who'd served in Korea. Military training left marks on a man that never fully faded. "Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind me asking, are you a veteran?" Bear's expression didn't change, but Rodriguez caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or old pain. "Vietnam. 1st Cavalry Division. 2 tours." "Thank you for your service," Rodriguez said automatically, but she meant it. She'd grown up in a military family and understood the weight that service could place on a person. Bear nodded acknowledgement, but didn't elaborate. Rodriguez got the impression that talking about his military service wasn't something he did often or easily. Chen was studying the cabin's simple layout with professional interest. "Mr. Mitchell, how long have you been living here?" 43 years come January, Bear replied. "Built this place myself after I got out of the army." "And you've been living here alone all this time?" "Yes, just me in the mountains. That's how I like it." Rodriguez could see Chen's wheels turning. As a social worker, he was probably wondering about isolation, depression, all the things that could happen to someone who'd spent 4 decades living alone in the wilderness. But looking around the cabin, Rodriguez saw no signs of neglect or mental decline. Everything was clean, organized, purposeful. Peterson had moved to a corner of the cabin where a wooden crate sat on the floor near the bed. The lid was slightly askew, and Rodriguez could see something metallic glinting inside. "What's in the box?" Peterson asked, his bureaucratic curiosity overriding any sense of privacy. For the first time since they'd arrived, Bear hesitated. "Just some old things. Nothing valuable." But Peterson was already kneeling beside the crate, lifting the lid. "I need to document all personal property for the eviction inventory." Rodriguez saw Bear's jaw tighten, but he didn't try to stop Peterson from looking inside. Whatever was in that box, Bear clearly didn't want to discuss it, but he also wasn't going to fight about it. Peterson lifted the lid fully, and Rodriguez heard him draw in a sharp breath. "Holy shit," he muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, it's just, these are military medals." Rodriguez moved closer to see what had caused Peterson's reaction. The wooden crate contained what looked like a lifetime's worth of military honors. Ribbons, medals, unit patches, and commendations arranged with the same military precision that characterized everything else in Bear's cabin. But it was the medal Peterson held up that made Rodriguez's heart skip a beat. Purple with gold edges, a profile of George Washington in the center, hanging from a purple ribbon. Even someone with limited military knowledge would recognize it. "Mr. Mitchell," Rodriguez said quietly, "is this a Purple Heart?" Bear's silence was answer enough. Rodriguez could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't just an invasion of his privacy. This was exposure of something he'd kept hidden for decades. Chen moved to look over Peterson's shoulder. "There are more medals here. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Combat Infantry Badge. Mr. Mitchell, you're highly decorated." Bear corrected firmly. "That was a long time ago." But Rodriguez was studying the citation that accompanied the Purple Heart. As she read, her understanding of who Thomas Mitchell really was began to shift dramatically. Rodriguez read the citation aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Specialist Thomas Mitchell, United States Army, is awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in action against hostile forces in the Republic of Vietnam on March 15, 1969. When his unit came under intense enemy fire from a concealed machine gun position, Specialist Mitchell deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire to draw attention away from wounded comrades. Despite sustaining multiple gunshot wounds, he continued to provide covering fire until medical evacuation could be completed, saving the lives of 7 fellow soldiers." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the wood stove. Rodriguez felt her throat tighten as she continued reading. Additional commendations include the Bronze Star with V device for valor, Silver Star for gallantry in action, and the Combat Infantry Badge. Peterson had gone pale. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side as he stared at the collection of medals. I had no idea." Rodriguez picked up another citation, this one for the Silver Star. "Specialist Mitchell single-handedly assaulted an enemy bunker complex, neutralizing multiple machine gun positions and allowing his platoon to advance. His actions resulted in the capture of a strategic hill and the successful completion of the mission. Bear stood motionless, watching them read through the documentation of his military service like they were examining artifacts in a museum. Rodriguez could see the pain in his eyes, not physical pain, but the deeper ache of memories he'd spent 40 years trying to bury in these mountains. "Mr. Mitchell," Chin said softly, "why didn't you mention your military record when you were dealing with the tax assessment? The VA has programs for disabled veterans, property tax exemptions for Purple Heart recipients. You could have qualified for assistance." Bear's laugh was bitter. "I didn't want assistance. I wanted to be left alone." Rodriguez was still studying the medals, piecing together a picture of a man whose service had been extraordinary even by military standards. Multiple Purple Hearts indicated he'd been wounded more than once, but had returned to combat. The Bronze Star with V device was awarded only for acts of valor under fire. The Silver Star was one step below the Medal of Honor. "Sir," Rodriguez said, her voice taking on a tone of respect she hadn't felt when she'd first arrived. "These decorations indicate you were wounded multiple times in combat. You're a disabled veteran." "I'm aware of that," Bear replied quietly. Peterson was frantically shuffling through his paperwork. "This changes things. The state has provisions for disabled veterans, especially Purple Heart recipients. There are exemptions, deferrals, special considerations." But Bear shook his head. "I've been paying what they asked me to pay for 40 years. If that wasn't enough, then the system failed, not me." Rodriguez understood now why Bear had been so resigned to the eviction. This wasn't about money or bureaucracy for him. It was about a fundamental loss of faith in the country he'd served and bled for. He'd given everything he had in Vietnam, come home to a nation that didn't want to hear about his service, and built a life in these mountains where his sacrifices might finally mean something. Now that same country was taking away the only place where he'd found peace. Chun was already on his phone. "I'm calling the VA regional office. This eviction needs to be stopped immediately while we sort out Mr. Mitchell's benefit status." But Bear held up a hand. "Don't. Sir, you have rights as a disabled veteran. You have benefits you've never claimed, protections under federal law." I said don't. There was quiet authority in Bear's voice, the kind of command presence that came from leading men in combat. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I made my choice a long time ago. I didn't want to be part of the system anymore." Rodriguez felt frustration building in her chest. Here was a man who'd given everything for his country, and he was too proud or too wounded to accept the help he'd earned. "Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, this isn't about pride anymore. This is about justice." Bear moved to the window and stared out at the mountains that had been his home for 4 decades. "Justice? I watched good men die in rice paddies for a war nobody wanted. I came home to protesters calling me a baby killer and politicians pretending we didn't exist. I built this place with my own hands because it was the only way I could find any peace." His voice was steady, but Rodriguez could hear the depth of pain underneath. "Now you're telling me I should trust the same government that sent me to Vietnam to take care of me in my old age? That I should believe the system will work better now than it did 50 years ago?" Peterson was sweating despite the cool mountain air. "Sir, I think there's been a serious mistake with your tax assessment. These veterans' benefits should have been applied decades ago." "The mistake," Bear said quietly, "was thinking I could hide up here forever and the world would leave me alone." Rodriguez made a decision that went against everything in her training as a law enforcement officer. She pulled out her radio and called her dispatcher. "This is Sheriff Rodriguez. I need you to contact the district attorney's office and the county commissioners immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate legal review." Bear turned from the window. "Sheriff, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but—" "No, sir," Rodriguez interrupted. "You don't get to make this decision alone anymore. You served your country with honor, you were wounded multiple times in combat, and you've been living here for 40 years paying taxes the county told you to pay. This eviction is not happening today." She turned to Peterson. "Pack up your paperwork. We're leaving, and this property is not being seized until every veteran's benefit and legal protection has been reviewed by people who know what they're doing." Peterson started to protest. "I have my orders from the state." "Your orders," Rodriguez said firmly, "don't override federal law protecting disabled veterans. And if you try to proceed with this eviction without proper legal review, I'll arrest you for violating Mr. Mitchell's civil rights." Chen was nodding vigorously. Sheriff Rodriguez is absolutely right. The VA has strict protections for disabled veterans facing housing issues. This case should have been referred to federal authorities before any eviction proceedings began. Bear was watching this exchange with something that might have been amazement. For 40 years, he'd expected nothing from the system except to be left alone. Now 3 strangers were fighting for his rights with more passion than he'd shown himself. Rodriguez walked over to the wooden crate and carefully replaced the Purple Heart citation. Mr. Mitchell, I know you've spent 40 years not trusting the system, but sometimes the system works when the right people are paying attention. Will you let us try to make this right? Bear looked around his cabin, at the simple life he'd built with his own hands, at the peace he'd found in these mountains. Then he looked at the 3 people who'd come to evict him and were now fighting to protect him. I suppose, he said finally, it can't hurt to try. Rodriguez's radio calls set off a chain reaction that reached from the Colorado mountains to the halls of Congress. Within hours, the story of Thomas Bear Mitchell had captured the attention of veterans advocacy groups, legal aid organizations, and media outlets across the country. The legal review that followed revealed a bureaucratic nightmare spanning 4 decades. Bear's disability rating had never been properly processed when he'd first bought the property. The county had been assessing his taxes without applying the veteran's exemptions he was entitled to. The state had been demanding back payments on taxes he should never have owed in the first place. But more than that, Bear's case highlighted a systemic problem. Thousands of Vietnam veterans had returned from war to find a country that didn't want to acknowledge their service. Many had, like Bear, retreated from society rather than fight for benefits they'd earned. How many others were living quietly, asking for nothing, receiving nothing, while bureaucracies failed them? The eviction was not only stopped, it was reversed. Bear not only got to keep his cabin, he received a formal apology from the state of Colorado and a refund of decades of overpaid taxes. The money was enough to ensure he could live comfortably on his mountain for the rest of his life. More importantly, Bear's story prompted a comprehensive review of veterans' benefits in Colorado and other states. Outreach programs were established to find other veterans who might have fallen through the cracks. Legal aid clinics were set up specifically to help aging veterans navigate the bureaucracy that had failed them for so long. Bear himself remained characteristically modest about the attention his case had generated. He granted one interview to a veterans magazine, but only to encourage other veterans to seek the help they'd earned. Don't make my mistake, he told the reporter. Don't let pride or pain keep you from getting what you deserve. Sheriff Rodriguez became something of a hero in veterans circles for her refusal to proceed with the eviction. She used her new platform to advocate for better training for law enforcement officers in recognizing and assisting veterans in crisis. The cabin in the mountains remained unchanged. Bear continued to live quietly, tending his small garden, watching the seasons change, finding peace in the silence of the high country. But now he lived with the knowledge that his service had been recognized, his sacrifice acknowledged, his rights protected. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch watching the sun set behind the peaks, Bear sometimes thought about the 7 men whose lives he'd saved in Vietnam. He'd never learned all their names, never seen most of them again after that day in March 1969. But he liked to think that somewhere, those men had gone on to live full lives, to raise families, to contribute to the world in ways that justified the price he'd paid. The Purple Heart in the wooden crate by his bed represented more than his own wounds. It represented a promise that service and sacrifice would be remembered, that those who gave everything for their country would not be forgotten or abandoned. For 40 years, Bear had believed that promise had been broken. But sometimes, it just takes the right people at the right moment to prove that honor still means something, that promises can still be kept, that the system can still work for those who've given everything to protect it. The mountains kept their silence, but Bear's story echoed far beyond the Colorado peaks. It reminded a nation that heroes don't always wear uniforms, don't always ask for recognition, don't always demand what they've earned. Sometimes they live quietly among us, carrying their burdens alone, asking for nothing more than to be left in peace. But they deserve more than peace. They deserve justice, recognition, and the promise that their sacrifices will never be forgotten, never be diminished, never be repaid with bureaucratic indifference. Thomas Bear Mitchell found all of that in a wooden crate in a mountain cabin. defended by strangers who understood that some debts can never be fully repaid, but they can be honored. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet dignity masked extraordinary sacrifice? Someone who asked for nothing but deserved everything? Tell us in the comments about the unrecognized veterans and heroes in your own community. And if you believe our veterans deserve better than bureaucratic indifference, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every story we share is a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and the greatest heroes are often the ones who never ask for recognition. We'll see you in the next one.